2 jobs, 1 question. Have you ever stood in a parking lot at midnight, hands cold, body tired, phone almost dead, and suddenly asked yourself a question you didn't plan to ask? Not about money, not about work, but about love. About whether the person waiting for you at home will still be there after another long shift. That was me in America, holding 2 jobs, 1 hope, and 1 quiet question I was afraid to say out loud. Can love survive like this? I didn't come to the United States chasing some dramatic dream. No luxury. No movie-style success. I came for something smaller and heavier at the same time. Stability. A future. A chance to breathe without constantly worrying about tomorrow. Like many immigrants, I told myself, just work hard first. Feel later. That sentence sounds reasonable until later never comes. My days started early. Sometimes before sunrise, when the air still felt sharp and unfamiliar. America has many climates, but the first thing I noticed wasn't the weather. It was the silence. People moved fast, spoke short, and kept their distance. In those early months, English surrounded me like background noise, familiar words, unfamiliar weight. I could understand enough to work, but not enough to feel human. Job 1 paid the bills. Job 2 paid the fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of not being enough. Fear of becoming invisible. When people say, I work 2 jobs, it sounds strong. Responsible. But what they don't say is how your life becomes a series of fragments. A few minutes here. A rushed meal there. Conversations cut in half. Love squeezed into whatever space is left. At home, we didn't fight much. And that was the problem. Silence replaced arguments. Tiredness replaced affection. We spoke in practical sentences. Did you eat? What time do you work tomorrow? English or not, the language of survival slowly took over. Somewhere between the alarm clock and the night shift, romance became optional. And English, my so-called goal, felt heavier each day. Not because it was hard, but because I was exhausted. My brain didn't want grammar. It wanted rest. Science actually explains this. When the brain is under constant stress, it prioritizes survival over learning. Your mind doesn't fail you. It protects you. But protection can look a lot like giving up. I remember one moment clearly. A simple one. A cashier asked me a casual question, something easy. I understood every word. But my mouth froze. Not from lack of vocabulary. From lack of energy. That's when it hit me. Learning English wasn't the real challenge. Living like this was. Still, I kept going. Because quitting wasn't an option. Immigrant life rarely gives you dramatic breakdowns. It gives you slow erosion. You don't collapse. You fade. And the scariest part? You get used to it. Love, too, becomes quiet. Not gone. Just waiting. Waiting for time. Waiting for attention. Waiting for you to notice it's still there. Sometimes, late at night, I would think, we came all this way, for what? 2 jobs. 1 home. 1 shared dream that felt smaller every day. America teaches you independence quickly, but it doesn't teach you how to stay connected while surviving. Here's something no one tells you about language learning. You don't really learn a language when you're motivated. You learn it when it becomes part of your emotional life. When words attach themselves to moments. To fear. To hope. To love. Back then, English was just a tool. For work. for instructions, for short answers. It hadn't entered my heart yet. And because of that, it couldn't stay. Psychologists call this emotional relevance. The brain remembers what matters to your identity. At that point, English wasn't who I was. It was just what I needed to get through the day. And love? Love was patient, but not infinite. This section of the story isn't about failure. It's about the question that starts everything. The moment you realize that survival alone is not the same as living. That 2 jobs can pay rent, but they can't automatically protect a relationship. That learning English fast means nothing if you're slowly losing yourself. If you're listening to this while tired, maybe after work, maybe on a break, maybe wondering why your English hasn't improved the way you hoped, pause for a second. It's not because you're lazy. It's because your life is heavy right now. And here's the quiet promise of this journey. If love can survive exhaustion, misunderstanding, silence, and fear, then learning English slowly, gently through real life, can survive too. This is where the story begins. Not with success, not with fluency, but with one honest question, standing between 2 jobs and one fragile hope. America was not a movie. Midnight air in America feels different when you're new. It doesn't rush to welcome you. It just exists cold, quiet, and indifferent. I learned that early. Not from people, not from work, but from the way the night swallowed sound when I stepped outside after a long shift. No background music. No dramatic moment. Just me, my breath, and the realization that this country I imagined for years was not going to perform for me. The shock wasn't loud. It was subtle and constant. Movies teach you that America shines. Real life teaches you that America functions. And function, while impressive, can feel lonely when you're still learning how to stand inside it. Climate was the first teacher. Not weather reports or temperatures, but how long the cold stayed. Winter didn't visit, it moved in. Short daylight hours quietly drained energy. Mornings felt heavier. Muscles resisted movement. The body noticed before the mind did. Scientists say reduced sunlight affects mood and motivation, and I didn't need a study to believe it. I felt slower, quieter, more withdrawn. Learning English during those months felt like trying to memorize poetry while carrying groceries uphill. Culture followed closely behind. In many places, people connect by default. In America, especially in busy cities, connection is selective. People protect their time fiercely. Conversations are efficient. Smiles are polite but brief. No one is cruel, but no one is waiting either. You're free and on your own. At work, I observed more than I spoke. Break rooms were silent theaters of scrolling thumbs. Lunch happened fast. Everyone returned to their tasks without ceremony. I kept thinking, where are the stories? Back home, stories filled the air. Here, productivity did. English sat in the middle of all this, quietly demanding attention. I understood instructions, but humor escaped me. Sarcasm arrived late. By the time I laughed, the moment had already passed. Cultural English isn't taught in textbooks. It lives between sentences. Without it, you feel like you're always half a second behind. That half second matters. It's the difference between belonging and observing. Between participating and pretending. I smiled a lot during those months, not from joy, but from caution. Smiling buys you time when you're unsure what's happening. At home, the environment changed us too. We talked less about feelings and more about logistics. Weather forecasts became small talk. Schedules replaced dreams. We weren't unhappy, we were conserving energy. Love didn't leave. It went quiet, the way animals do when winter lasts longer than expected. There's a psychological reason for this. When humans face unfamiliar environments, the brain shifts into monitoring mode. It watches for patterns, threats, rules. This consumes mental bandwidth. Language learning, which requires curiosity and play, struggles to compete. So if English felt harder here than you expected, it wasn't failure. It was biology. I blamed myself at first. Why couldn't I adapt faster? Why did simple conversations feel exhausting? Why did I miss jokes everyone else caught easily? The answer wasn't effort. It was overload. New climate. New culture. New expectations. My brain was busy surviving politely. One small moment stayed with me. A coworker said, "Not bad," when asked how they were. The tone meant neutral. Acceptable. Not good, not terrible. I had heard those words before, but this time I understood the meaning underneath. America often communicates emotion in understatement. Once I noticed that, the culture felt less cold and more controlled. Seasons shifted slowly. When spring arrived, something else changed with it. People lingered a little longer outside. Conversations stretched. The air softened. So did I. It became clear that climate wasn't just background, it was shaping behavior, mood, and connection every single day. That realization brought relief. America wasn't rejecting me. It was responding to its own environment. And so was I. For immigrants, this stage is dangerous. Not because it breaks you, but because it normalizes numbness. You stop expecting warmth. You stop reaching out. You tell yourself this is just how life is now. Many people stay there for years. English, during this phase, becomes mechanical. Functional phrases. Work vocabulary. Survival language. And that's fine for a while. But language learned without emotion doesn't stick deeply. It floats. It disappears when you're tired. It doesn't grow. Love feels the same way. Without shared moments, it becomes practical, reliable, thin. The hopeful truth is this: awareness changes everything. The moment I stopped expecting America to feel like a movie, I started seeing it clearly. This country rewards patience more than enthusiasm. Consistency more than passion. Quiet effort over dramatic dreams. That's when hope shifted shape. It stopped being loud. It became steady. I began to understand that surviving the climate, both weather and cultural, was part of the story, not a detour from it. If you're listening and thinking, why does everything feel heavier here? Good. That weight means you're adjusting. You're learning the invisible rules. You're building resilience you don't yet recognize. America was not a movie. It was a slow, demanding series. And I was still learning how to live inside the frame, holding on to love, learning English gently, and discovering that sometimes endurance is the first step toward belonging. When English felt heavy, morning light came through the window, but my brain stayed dark. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in my hands, already tired before the day officially started. English waited for me everywhere, in emails, signs, schedules, small talk. But that morning it felt heavier than my backpack. Heavier than the double shifts ahead. Not difficult. Heavy. Like something I had to carry instead of something I could use. People often assume that struggling with English means not knowing enough words. That wasn't my problem. I knew the words. I could understand instructions, follow rules, respond correctly. But English, in real life, asks for more than correctness. It asks for timing, tone, confidence. And confidence is the first thing exhaustion steals. At work, English didn't arrive gently. It came fast, clipped, efficient. Can you cover? We're short. Clock in early. These weren't conversations. They were commands wrapped in casual tone. I answered yes more often than I should have, not because I wanted to, but because saying no in a second language costs extra energy. Every response required calculation. Every sentence had weight. There's a concept in psychology called decision fatigue. The more decisions you make, the worse your choices become. Immigrants experience this constantly. Not just big decisions, small ones. Should I say this? Is that polite? Did I understand correctly? Is my accent bothering them? English turned daily life into a series of micro-exams. By the end of the day, my brain wasn't tired. It was drained. That drain spilled into everything else. Conversations at home shortened. Jokes disappeared. I answered in nods. My partner noticed before I did. You're here, they said once, gently, but you're not really here. That sentence hurt more than any correction at work. English felt like the reason. But it wasn't the cause. It was the messenger. At one job, a coworker told a joke. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, late, uncertain. Someone glanced at me, smiling politely, and I realized I hadn't understood it at all. Humor requires cultural timing. Without it, you feel like a guest who arrived after the punchline. Those moments add up. Each one small. Together, heavy. Language learning experts talk about comprehensible input, listening to things you mostly understand. But no one talks enough about emotional readiness. When your nervous system is under stress, learning slows. Cortisol, the stress hormone, interferes with memory formation. Your brain prioritizes survival, not subtle grammar patterns. That's biology, not failure. Yet self-blame crept in. Why am I not improving faster? Why does English still feel exhausting after all this time? Social media didn't help. Everywhere, success stories. I learned English in 6 months. I became fluent while working full-time. What those posts don't show is context. Support systems. Energy levels. Emotional safety. My English wasn't weak. My life was overloaded. Some days, the smallest interactions felt like obstacles. Ordering food. Making a phone call. Explaining a simple issue to customer service. Each task demanded clarity while my mind begged for silence. By the time I got home, I didn't want to hear any language at all. Not English. Not my own. Love felt the weight too. We began communicating like coworkers managing a shared project. Efficient. Functional. Did you pay the bill? What time is your shift? Important questions, but empty of warmth. Romance doesn't disappear in chaos. It starves quietly. I remember one night lying awake, replaying a conversation from earlier that day. Not because it went badly, but because I kept wondering how I could have said it better. That loop is familiar to anyone learning a language under pressure. The brain doesn't rest. It rehearses. That's when something clicked. English wasn't heavy because it was difficult. It was heavy because it carried too much responsibility. It was tied to income, stability, respect, survival. Every sentence mattered. Every mistake felt expensive. Children learn languages quickly because language is play. Immigrants learn languages slowly because language is risk. Once I saw that, the shame softened. I wasn't broken. I was cautious. And caution makes sense when your life depends on getting things right. The turning point didn't come from a class or a textbook. It came from a small decision. Stop forcing English to perform. Instead, let it exist. I started noticing English where it felt lighter. Short exchanges. Simple phrases. Familiar routines. Repetition without pressure. Same words, same context, day after day. That's how the brain relaxes. That's how learning sneaks back in. At home, I tried something similar. Fewer explanations. More listening. Not to fix, not to respond perfectly, just to be present. Love doesn't need perfect grammar. It needs attention. Slowly, English lost some of its weight. Not because it improved overnight, but because I stopped tying my worth to it. The language didn't change. My relationship with it did. If English feels heavy for you right now, pause. Ask what it's carrying. Fear? Pressure? Expectations? Survival? Languages aren't meant to hold all that alone. When you let English be imperfect, human, and connected to real moments, not constant performance, it breathes. And when language breathes, love often follows. This wasn't the chapter where I became fluent. It was the chapter where I stopped drowning. And sometimes, that's the most important progress of all. Love between shifts. The clock didn't just tell time anymore. It controlled us. Our days were divided into blocks, before work, between shifts, after midnight, and love learned to live in the cracks. Not the romantic kind of cracks you see in movies. The practical ones. 10 minutes in the kitchen. A shared ride. A quiet nod that said, I see you, even when words felt expensive. We didn't fall apart loudly. We thinned out. Affection became efficient. Kisses turned into check-ins. Did you eat? Replaced, how are you really? It wasn't neglect. It was survival wearing a responsible face. 2 jobs do something subtle to a relationship. They don't steal love all at once. They steal rhythm. When schedules don't overlap, intimacy has to be scheduled too. And anything scheduled starts to feel optional when exhaustion shows up early and leaves late. English hovered in the background of everything. We spoke it at work all day, then came home too tired to speak anything well. When we argued, we chose the simplest words. When we made up, we didn't explain much. Nuance requires energy. We were low on fuel. There's research on this. Chronic stress reduces emotional availability. Your nervous system stays on alert, scanning for tasks, deadlines, threats. Connection requires safety. And safety was fragile when rent, time, and language all felt uncertain. I remember one evening clearly. We were both home at the same time, rare, precious. We sat on the couch, phones nearby, TV on low. Together, but not touching. I thought about saying something meaningful. Something reassuring. But the sentence formed slowly in my head, translated twice, and by the time it was ready, the moment had passed. Silence filled the space instead. Not angry silence. Tired silence. The kind that feels heavier because no one is wrong. Immigrant couples face a strange paradox. You're fighting the world together, but you're rarely resting together. The outside pressure pushes you inward, but without time, inward becomes crowded. Small misunderstandings grow because there's no space to unpack them. We didn't stop caring. We stopped narrating our care. English made this harder in quiet ways. Expressing vulnerability in a second language can feel like undressing in public. You worry about tone, about clarity, about sounding childish or dramatic. So you choose safety, short sentences, neutral expressions. You protect yourself by simplifying, and simplicity, over time, can flatten emotion. I noticed how American couples around us communicated. Brief affection, quick check-ins, independence valued. It looked efficient. But we weren't raised inside that system. We were still translating not just words, but expectations. What does love look like here? How much is enough? Late nights were the hardest. That's when questions arrived uninvited. Is this just a phase? Or is this what we've become? Two people managing life side by side, hoping love would remember us later. The brain does a strange thing under pressure. It postpones joy. Tells you not now. After this shift. After this bill. After things settle. But life rarely settles. It just changes form. One small habit kept us connected without us realizing it. A shared routine. Coffee in silence. A text during breaks. Not deep conversations anchors. Psychologists call these micro-connections. Brief, consistent signals of care. They don't solve problems, but they prevent drift. We survived on those. A note on the fridge. A shared laugh over something trivial. Physical presence without performance. Love learned to whisper. English began to sneak back in through those moments. Not as practice. As life. A simple phrase repeated. The same joke again and again, until it felt natural. Language grows faster when it's attached to someone you care about. The brain pays attention when emotion is involved. I stopped trying to sound impressive. I aimed for honest. Less explanation. More listening. Listening is underrated in language learning and in love. When you listen, you give the other person space to exist without correction. There was a night when we finally talked, not dramatically, not perfectly, just honestly. In simple English. Pauses included. No metaphors. No speeches. Just truth, spoken slowly enough to survive. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it shifted something important. Pressure eased. Expectations softened. We weren't failing. We were adapting. Love between shifts isn't glamorous. It doesn't post well online, but it's real. It's built from patience, not fireworks. From showing up, even briefly. From choosing connection when rest would be easier. If you're watching this while juggling work, language, and a relationship that feels quieter than it used to, hear this clearly. Quiet doesn't mean gone. It often means tired. And tired things can rest. English doesn't need to be perfect to carry love. Love doesn't need constant attention to survive. They both need space to breathe. This chapter wasn't about romance returning. It was about stability forming. And sometimes, stability is the bravest version of love there is. Working more, feeling less. Alarm clocks don't sound aggressive when you hear them once. They become cruel when they ring twice a day. Morning shift. Night shift. Somewhere in between, life was supposed to happen. But most days, it didn't. I worked more hours than I could count, yet felt less present in everything that mattered. Less patient. Less curious. Less myself. 2 jobs create a strange illusion. On paper, you're progressing. More income. More responsibility. More proof that you're trying. Inside, though, something thins out. Motivation fades quietly. Emotions flatten. The mind switches to autopilot because thinking deeply costs energy you don't have. English lived inside that autopilot mode. I used it constantly, but rarely consciously. Same phrases. Same responses. Same routines. Language stopped feeling like learning and started feeling like labor. And labor, when it never pauses, drains meaning from everything it touches. At work, people praised reliability. You're always here. You never complain. I smiled, said thanks, and kept moving. What they didn't see was the cost. Reliability can become a trap when it replaces growth. The brain adapts to repetition by conserving energy. You stop noticing details. You stop experimenting. You survive efficiently. There's neuroscience behind this. When tasks become routine under stress, the brain shifts from learning mode to performance mode. You do what you know works and avoid risk. Language learning, however, needs risk. New sounds. New structures. New mistakes. I wasn't avoiding English, I was avoiding uncertainty. The same thing happened at home. We were efficient partners. Bills paid. Schedules aligned. Responsibilities handled. Emotionally, though, we were operating on low battery. Conversations stayed on the surface because deeper ones felt like extra shifts we couldn't afford. Love under chronic workload doesn't collapse, it compresses. It becomes functional, supportive, quiet. You stop asking big questions because you don't have time for big answers. I noticed it one evening when I couldn't remember the last time I felt excited about anything. Not sad. Not angry. Just flat. That's a warning sign psychologists talk about. Emotional blunting. When the nervous system stays under pressure too long, it dulls feeling to protect itself. English suffered in that same way. Without emotion, words didn't stick. I could hear them all day and remember nothing by night. My ears worked. My memory didn't. Many immigrants blame discipline at this stage. I should study more. I should practice harder. But effort without recovery backfires. The brain learns during rest, not grind. Sleep consolidates memory. Downtime strengthens neural connections. I had neither. 2 jobs also distorted time. Weeks blurred. Months passed unnoticed. Progress felt invisible because there was no pause to measure it. That's dangerous for motivation. Humans need feedback to stay engaged. Without it, hope quietly leaks out. One afternoon, during a short break, I caught my reflection in a window. Tired eyes. Slouched shoulders. I looked older than I felt inside. That moment wasn't dramatic. It was honest. I realized I was trading depth for durability. English, love, and identity were all caught in the same pattern. Do more. Feel less. The shift didn't start with quitting a job or changing everything overnight. That fantasy belongs in movies. Real change started smaller. I stopped filling every gap with productivity. 10 minutes of silence. A slow walk. One conversation without multitasking. Those pauses felt uncomfortable at first. When you're used to being busy, stillness feels like laziness. But stillness is where awareness returns. I started noticing how often I rushed through language, how rarely I listened fully. Listening, it turns out, requires less energy than performing. At home, I tried being present instead of efficient. Fewer solutions. More attention. Less fixing. More noticing. Love doesn't need grand gestures when it's tired. It needs rest. English re-entered my life through those quiet moments. Not as study, but as observation. The same phrases repeated. The same tones. The same patterns. Repetition with awareness creates learning without force. There's research showing that low-pressure exposure improves long-term retention. When stress drops, the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, functions better. Learning feels lighter because it is. Working less wasn't immediately possible. Feeling more was. If you're in a season where you're doing everything right but feeling nothing, pause before blaming yourself. Burnout doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers through numbness. 2 jobs can support a life, but they can't define it. English can help you function, but it can't replace connection. Love can endure workload, but not neglect of presence. This chapter wasn't about quitting. It was about noticing the cost of constant doing. And realizing that feeling less isn't strength, it's a signal. When you start honoring that signal, even gently, hope stops shrinking. It waits. Patient. Ready to return when you finally make space for it. The quiet cracks. Silence has a sound when it lasts too long. It hums. It fills rooms. It settles between 2 people who once finished each other's sentences and now finish each other's schedules. Our home didn't feel broken. It felt carefully managed. And that, I learned, can be more dangerous. The cracks didn't arrive with arguments. They arrived with agreement. We agreed on everything important: work hours, bills, responsibilities. We agreed so often that disagreement felt unnecessary, even risky. When life is heavy, peace becomes the highest goal. But peace without honesty slowly turns into distance. This is how many relationships bend under pressure in America, especially immigrant ones. You're taught to be strong, to endure, to be grateful. Complaining feels irresponsible when survival is at stake. So you swallow discomfort. You tell yourself it's temporary. You keep going. English played a quiet role here too. Expressing complex emotions in a second language can feel like walking on thin ice. You worry about being misunderstood, about sounding dramatic, about choosing the wrong word and opening a door you don't have energy to walk through. So you choose silence. Silence feels safe. For a while. At work, communication was direct and efficient. At home, it became minimal and cautious. We were protecting each other from extra stress, or so we thought. In reality, we were protecting ourselves from vulnerability. There's a psychological pattern behind this. When couples face chronic stress, they often shift into functional mode. Tasks get done. Emotions get postponed. The relationship becomes a system instead of a space. Systems work until something small breaks and no one knows how to fix it anymore. The cracks showed up in subtle ways. Eye contact lasted a second less. Touch became practical, a handoff, a reminder, a nudge. Conversations ended with "it's fine" instead of "let's talk." Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just erosion. I remember one night when we sat at the same table, eating different meals at different times. Same room. Different worlds. The TV filled the gaps between us. It talked so we didn't have to. That's when it hit me. Silence had become a habit. English, again, mirrored the problem. I was hearing it all day, but not really engaging with it. I understood enough to function, not enough to connect. Language without connection becomes noise. Relationship without conversation becomes routine. Neuroscience explains why this feels so heavy. Emotional suppression activates stress responses in the body. You may look calm, but your nervous system stays alert. Over time, this creates fatigue, irritability, and emotional numbness. Silence isn't neutral. It has a cost. We told ourselves we were just tired, that things would improve once schedules eased. But schedules rarely ease on their own. Life fills every open space unless you protect it. One evening, something small broke through. Not a fight. A question. A simple one, asked without accusation. It landed gently, but it landed deep. And for a moment, the silence cracked. The conversation that followed wasn't smooth. Words came slowly. Pauses stretched. English felt clumsy. But something important happened. We stayed. We didn't rush to fix. We didn't minimize. We listened. Listening is underrated in both love and language. It requires presence, not performance. You don't need perfect words to listen well. You need patience. And patience, I realized, was something we still had even if energy was low. That night didn't solve our problems, but it changed the direction. Silence stopped being the default. Not because we suddenly talked more, but because we acknowledged what the silence was doing to us. I started noticing how often Americans around me used small verbal check-ins. You good? All set? Simple phrases repeated daily. They weren't deep, but they were consistent. Consistency creates safety. Safety invites honesty. So we borrowed that idea. Small check-ins. No pressure. No long talks unless they happen naturally. Just signals. I'm here. I see you. Those signals mattered more than speeches. English improved quietly through that process. The same phrases repeated in emotional contexts. Words attached to feeling. That's how memory works. Emotion tags language for storage. Without emotion, words slide off. The quiet cracks didn't disappear overnight. Some are still there. But cracks don't always mean collapse. Sometimes they mean flexibility. They show where pressure is highest, where attention is needed. If you're watching this and recognizing that quiet distance in your own life, know this. Silence doesn't mean failure. It means something is waiting to be heard. And you don't need perfect English or perfect timing to begin listening. Relationships don't break because people stop caring. They break because caring stops being expressed. Expression doesn't require elegance. It requires courage. This chapter was uncomfortable to live through. It forced me to admit that endurance alone isn't enough. You can survive silently and still lose what matters most. The good news is this: cracks reveal structure. They show you what holds and what needs support. When you stop fearing the silence and start understanding it, love doesn't retreat. It recalibrates. That realization didn't fix everything, but it made room. And room, I learned, is where healing and language finally have space to grow. English hid in daily life. English didn't suddenly get easier. It got closer. It slipped out of textbooks and apps and quietly moved into my ordinary days, hiding in places I used to ignore. Not lessons. Not drills. Life. And once I noticed that, everything changed. Mornings became my first classroom. The same cashier greeting me with the same words. The same tone. The same rhythm. At first, I answered automatically. Then I started listening, really listening. Not to respond faster, but to hear the pattern. Intonation. Pauses. The way meaning lived between words. This wasn't studying. This was noticing. Daily life in America runs on repetition. Same routes. Same routines. Same phrases. That repetition is gold for language learning, especially when your energy is limited. Neuroscience calls this passive acquisition. When the brain encounters familiar input in low-stress environments, it absorbs without resistance. No flashcards required. English appeared in small moments. Reading signs while waiting. Listening to short exchanges at work. Watching how people complained politely. How they apologized quickly. How they moved on without drama. Culture and language were stitched together, and I finally saw the thread. At work, I stopped chasing new vocabulary and focused on understanding intention. Why did people say, just checking in? Why did let's circle back often mean, not now? Once I understood the emotional purpose behind phrases, they stuck. Language without context is fragile. Language with intent is durable. At home, something shifted too. We stopped trying to have perfect conversations. We had real ones. Simple. Repetitive. Honest. The same phrases returned night after night. That repetition built comfort. Comfort built confidence. Confidence made English feel lighter. Children learn language through repetition and emotion. Adults forget this. We try to learn through pressure. Pressure blocks memory. Emotion opens it. Love, frustration, humor. These are powerful teachers. I started associating English with specific feelings. Relief when a task was done. Satisfaction when understood. Warmth when sharing something small. The brain remembers what matters. Once English mattered emotionally, it stayed. There's research backing this up. Emotional salience increases memory retention. When language connects to personal experience, neural pathways strengthen faster. That's why stories work better than drills. That's why daily life became my classroom. America itself became a teacher. Whether conversations taught timing. Workplace small talk taught boundaries. Casual friendliness taught distance. These weren't lessons from a book. They were lived experiences. And because they were lived, they lasted. I stopped measuring progress in fluency and started measuring it in ease. Less hesitation. Fewer mental translations. More presence. Language learning isn't a straight line. It's a gradual fade from effort to instinct. English no longer demanded performance. It invited participation. Love benefited too. When language became part of life instead of a test, communication softened. We laughed more, explained less, trusted more. Understanding grew without forcing clarity every time. The biggest realization was this: you don't need more English to live your life. You need English inside your life. Embedded, repeated, felt. If you're exhausted and struggling to study, stop studying. Start noticing. Let English come to you through routine, through repetition, through emotion. That's how the brain prefers to learn anyway. This chapter wasn't about mastering English. It was about letting it belong. And once it belonged, it stopped hiding. Family became the mirror. The first thing children learn is not language. It's mood. They read faces before words, tone before meaning. I didn't realize that until one quiet afternoon when everything I thought I was hiding reflected back at me clearly, honestly, without mercy. Family has a way of doing that. It holds up a mirror when you're too busy to look at yourself. By this point, life in the United States had settled into a routine. Not an easy one. A stable one. Work schedules ran smoothly. Bills were predictable. English floated around me with less resistance. On the surface, things looked fine. But inside the house, something felt thin. Not broken. Just stretched. Children notice that stretch immediately. They don't ask big questions at first. They ask small ones. Why are you always tired? Why don't you talk much? Why do you work so much? Simple words. Heavy impact. No grammar test could hit harder than that. In immigrant families, sacrifice is often the love language. You work more so your family worries less. You endure so they don't have to. But sacrifice without presence creates confusion. Children don't measure love in hours worked. They measure it in attention given. That realization hurt. Not because it accused me, but because it was true. English entered this space differently. Not as a skill. As a bridge. When children start school, language becomes part of the home whether you want it or not. Homework. Notes. Short conversations about long days. English stopped being optional. It became shared territory. I noticed something important. Children weren't afraid of English. They played with it, misused it, mixed it, laughed at mistakes. They learned fast, not because they were smarter, but because they weren't protecting their identity. They didn't tie language to worth. Adults do. Watching them changed how I felt about my own learning. They didn't apologize for accents. They didn't freeze when searching for words. They filled gaps with creativity. Communication mattered more than correctness. Family became my most honest feedback loop. When I was distracted, they reacted. When I was present, they leaned in. No judgment. Just response. That's when I saw the pattern clearly. English struggled when I was emotionally absent. It flowed when I was engaged. The same was true for love. Neuroscience supports this. Social connection activates learning centers in the brain. When we feel safe and seen, our brains become more flexible. Memory improves. Attention sharpens. Language sticks. At the dinner table, English showed up naturally. Simple sentences. Repeated phrases. Familiar questions. No pressure. No evaluation. Just life unfolding. Family conversations don't need advanced vocabulary. They need clarity and care. That lowered the bar and raised the quality. I also saw my own fears reflected back. fear of not providing enough, fear of falling behind, fear of being misunderstood. Children absorb emotional climates even when words are few. My stress had been teaching them something I didn't intend. That realization didn't bring guilt. It brought responsibility. I started changing small things. Phone away during conversations. Short walks together. Listening without multitasking. Not perfect. Just intentional. Presence is not about time, it's about attention. English benefited immediately. Same phrases, same context, repeated daily. Language learning experts emphasize spaced repetition. Families do this naturally. That's why learning at home feels different. It's embedded in meaning. Love benefited too. When attention returned, warmth followed. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like a room warming after a heater clicks on. I stopped seeing family as something waiting for the future. It was happening now. And now is where learning lived. Many immigrants believe stability must come first, then connection. In reality, connection stabilizes. It grounds you when everything else feels uncertain. The mirror family holds is not cruel. It's accurate. It shows you where you are, not where you wish you were. And accuracy is a gift when you're trying to grow. English stopped being an individual challenge. It became collective. Shared jokes. Shared routines. Shared mistakes. That removed pressure. Pressure is the enemy of progress. If you're learning English while raising a family, don't separate the two. Let them overlap. Let life teach. Let repetition do the work. Let emotion guide memory. This chapter wasn't about parenting advice. It was about awareness. Family showed me that my greatest fear, falling short, was also my greatest motivation. They didn't need perfection. They needed presence. And presence, once reclaimed, changes everything. It softens language. It deepens love. It turns survival into something warmer, more human. Family didn't just reflect who I was. It showed me who I could still become. One small shift. The shift didn't announce itself. No dramatic decision. No late-night promise. It arrived quietly, disguised as something almost unimportant. A pause. A single moment when I stopped asking, how do I push harder? And started asking, what if I stop pushing at all? That question changed everything. Up to that point, my life in the United States had been about endurance. 2 jobs. Tight schedules. Careful language. Constant adjustment. I believed progress required pressure. More effort. More discipline. More sacrifice. That belief felt responsible. Mature. Logical. It was also slowly draining the meaning out of my days. The small shift was this. I stopped treating improvement, especially English and my relationship, as a problem to fix. I started treating it as something to support. Support feels different from force. Force demands results. Support creates conditions. This idea isn't poetic, it's neurological. The brain learns best when it feels safe. Not comfortable, safe. When threat levels drop, the prefrontal cortex engages, memory strengthens, and patterns become easier to recognize. Chronic stress blocks this process. I had been trying to learn, love, and live inside a constant low-grade emergency. The shift began with time. Not more time, better time. I stopped filling every empty minute with productivity. 10 minutes without a phone. A walk without an agenda. sitting at the table after dinner instead of standing up immediately. These moments felt almost wrong at first, like I was wasting something valuable. But what I was actually doing was returning value to my attention. English responded immediately, not by exploding into fluency, but by softening. I noticed how certain phrases repeated in the same situations. How tone mattered more than word choice. How Americans often communicated emotion indirectly, through timing, through understatement, through what they didn't say. Instead of memorizing new vocabulary, I stayed with familiar language longer. Repetition without pressure builds confidence. Confidence reduces fear. Fear is the real barrier, not grammar. The same shift applied to love. I stopped trying to be efficient in my relationship. Efficiency had kept things running, but it had also kept things shallow. I replaced solutions with curiosity. Instead of fixing, I asked. Instead of rushing, I stayed. Conversations didn't get longer. They got truer. This wasn't easy. Small shifts rarely are. Big changes come with excitement. Small ones come with discomfort because they remove your usual coping strategies. Busyness had been my shield. When I slowed down, feelings surfaced. Fatigue, doubt, fear, but also tenderness, humor, relief. I learned that progress doesn't always feel like moving forward. Sometimes it feels like standing still long enough to notice what's already there. At work, the shift showed up as boundaries. Not dramatic ones. Quiet ones. Saying no once. Taking a full break instead of checking messages. Protecting energy instead of spending it automatically. This didn't make me less reliable. It made me more present. Presence is contagious. English conversations became less rehearsed. I stopped translating everything in my head. I let silence exist. Americans are comfortable with pauses. I hadn't been. Once I accepted that, conversations breathed. Language learning experts talk about automaticity, the ability to use language without conscious effort. Automaticity doesn't come from speed. It comes from familiarity under low stress. That's what this small shift created. At home, the effect was even clearer. When I wasn't rushing, we connected without trying. Shared jokes returned. Lightness crept back in. Love didn't need rescuing. It needed room. The most surprising change was internal. I stopped narrating my life as a struggle. Words matter. Stories shape identity. I had been telling myself a story of survival. Necessary, but incomplete. With the shift, a new story emerged. Adaptation. Adaptation is quieter than struggle. It doesn't demand applause. It builds slowly. But it lasts. Many immigrants burn out not because they lack strength, but because they never give themselves permission to adjust their approach. They keep applying the same pressure to a life that has already changed. That mismatch creates exhaustion. The shift wasn't about lowering standards. It was about aligning them with reality. English didn't become perfect. Love didn't become effortless. Work didn't become light. But everything became sustainable. And sustainability is underrated. It's what allows hope to survive long enough to matter. If you're listening to this while feeling stuck, consider this. You may not need a new plan. You may need a gentler one. One that works with your nervous system instead of against it. One that allows learning to happen through living, not despite it. The smallest shift, how you treat your energy, your language, your relationships, can create the largest ripple. Not immediately, Not visibly, but steadily. That was the moment the question changed. It was no longer, can love survive? It became, what happens when I stop making survival the only goal? The answer didn't arrive all at once, but it started forming. Quietly, patiently, ready for what came next. Listening changed everything. Listening arrived before speaking got better. That surprised me. I had spent years believing progress meant saying more, sounding smoother, responding faster. Instead, everything began to change when I did the opposite. I slowed down. I stopped competing with silence. I let words come to me instead of chasing them. In America, listening is a skill hiding in plain sight. People talk fast, but they also pause more than you think. They expect space. They expect you to take a second. I had been filling every gap with effort, extra words, nervous explanations, rushed answers. Once I stopped doing that, conversations softened. At work, this mattered immediately. I didn't interrupt as much. I didn't rush to prove understanding. I waited for full instructions. I asked fewer questions, but better ones. Short, clarifying phrases. Calm tone. That alone reduced mistakes and stress. People responded differently too. They slowed down for me. Not out of pity, but because listening invited listening. There's science behind this. Mirror neurons activate when humans feel heard. When you listen fully, others unconsciously adjust their pace and clarity. Communication improves not because language improves, but because attention does. English benefited in ways I didn't expect. I started catching patterns I had missed for years. How Americans soften requests. How they signal disagreement politely. How "that's interesting" can mean curiosity or hesitation, depending on tone. Listening unlocked meaning textbooks never explained. At home, the change was deeper. I had thought listening meant staying quiet while waiting for my turn to speak. That's not listening. That's rehearsing. Real listening felt uncomfortable at first. It meant staying present when emotions surfaced. Not fixing. Not defending. Not translating feelings into neat solutions. When I listened without preparing a response, my partner spoke differently. Slower. More honestly. The conversation didn't escalate. It settled. Listening created safety. Safety allowed truth. Truth reduced distance. We spoke English imperfectly in those moments. Pauses. Repetition. Simple sentences. None of it mattered. Meaning traveled clearly because attention carried it. Psychologists call this attunement, the ability to sense and respond to another person's emotional state. Attunement strengthens relationships more than eloquence ever could. Language supports connection, but listening creates it. I noticed something else too. When I listened better, I remembered English better. Words stuck because they arrived attached to emotion. The brain encodes emotional information more deeply. Listening turned language into experience, not information. The habit spread into daily life. Listening to announcements. Listening to coworkers' tone changes. Listening to what wasn't said. America communicates a lot indirectly. Once I tuned into that frequency, confusion dropped. Confidence rose, not loud confidence, calm confidence. Love changed shape again. It became lighter, less guarded. We laughed more, not because life got easier, but because understanding returned. Laughter often follows being seen. Listening also changed how I talked to myself. I noticed the internal voice that kept pushing, criticizing, demanding speed. I listened to that too and questioned it. Was it helping or just familiar? Burnout often survives because no one listens to it. It whispers through fatigue and irritability. When you finally hear it, adjustment becomes possible. At work, listening improved performance without extra effort. At home, it rebuilt trust without speeches. In English, it accelerated comprehension without drills. The same skill supported everything. That's when the title of this journey felt different. 2 jobs, 1 hope. Hope wasn't tied to working less or earning more. It was tied to listening better. To people. To life. To limits. Many learners focus on output, speaking more, sounding native, mastering accents. Output matters. But output without input burns out quickly. Listening replenishes. It gives language somewhere to land. I stopped measuring my English by how much I spoke. I measured it by how well I understood. Understanding builds confidence quietly. Confidence makes speaking easier naturally. Love followed the same rule. Being heard mattered more than being impressive. Presence mattered more than persuasion. If you're learning English in the United States right now, especially while working long hours, try this shift. Listen for patterns, not perfection. Listen for intention, not vocabulary. Let conversations breathe. Let silence work for you. Listening isn't passive. It's active restraint. It's choosing understanding over performance. That choice changes dynamics everywhere. This chapter didn't end with fluency or romance restored overnight. It ended with alignment. Language, love, and life began moving at the same pace again. Listening changed everything, not because it added something new, but because it removed what was blocking progress. Noise, rush, fear. Once those quieted, hope didn't need to shout. It spoke softly, and I was finally listening. 2 jobs, new balance. Balance didn't arrive the way I expected. No dramatic schedule change. No sudden free weekends. Both jobs were still there, just as demanding, just as real. What changed was not the weight, but how I carried it. And that difference mattered more than I could have imagined. For a long time, I believed balance meant fewer hours. Less work. More rest. That's the version people like to sell because it's clean and visual. But for many immigrants in the United States, that version isn't immediately available. Rent doesn't negotiate. Bills don't wait. Life keeps moving. Balance, I learned, had to exist inside the same structure. The first sign of change was internal. I stopped feeling hunted by the clock. The hours were still full, but they weren't hostile anymore. I knew where my energy went, and more importantly, where it needed to stay. 2 jobs no longer defined my worth. They became tools instead of judges. That mental shift freed up something precious, attention. At work, I was still reliable, but I wasn't invisible. I spoke when it mattered. I listened when it didn't. English flowed more naturally because I wasn't forcing it to prove anything. Familiar phrases came out smoothly. New ones stuck because my brain wasn't overloaded. There's a concept in cognitive science called load management. When mental load drops, performance improves even if circumstances stay the same. That's what happened. Nothing outside changed. Everything inside did. At home, the difference was obvious. We didn't magically gain more time together, but the time we had felt whole. Phones down. Mine's present. Even short moments carried weight. A shared laugh before bed. A quick conversation that didn't feel rushed. Love stopped competing with exhaustion and started coexisting with it. English benefited here too. Conversations became warmer, less careful, more real. We repeated the same phrases often, and repetition built comfort. Comfort built fluency. Not textbook fluency, life fluency. I noticed how Americans around me handled balance. Not perfectly, but intentionally. Boundaries weren't loud. They were quiet decisions made consistently. Leaving work on time when possible. Not apologizing for rest. Valuing predictability. I borrowed that mindset. I stopped treating rest as a reward and started treating it as maintenance. Maintenance keeps systems running. Without it, everything breaks eventually. 2 jobs still required discipline. But discipline without self-awareness is punishment. With awareness, it becomes structure. The biggest change showed up in my body. Less tension. Better sleep. Slower breathing. The nervous system calmed down enough to support learning again. Language learning, relationship growth, emotional resilience, they all depend on a regulated system. English no longer disappeared when I was tired. It stayed accessible. Not sharp. Not perfect. But present. Love felt steadier. Not exciting in a cinematic way, but dependable. Deep. Safe. The kind of love that doesn't demand constant reassurance because it's built on consistent care. I stopped chasing motivation. Motivation is unreliable under pressure. I focused on habits instead. Small ones. Repeatable ones. Listening more. Reacting less. Showing up gently. This wasn't settling. It was maturing. Many people confuse balance with ease. Balance isn't easy. It's intentional. It requires saying no internally even when you say yes externally. It requires knowing your limits and respecting them even if no one else sees them. 2 jobs taught me discipline. Balance taught me sustainability. English, in this phase, became something I trusted. I didn't fear forgetting words. I didn't fear mistakes. I knew that exposure plus rest equals growth. That formula works quietly but consistently. If you're working long hours in the US right now and wondering when life will finally feel manageable, hear this. Balance doesn't always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it forms when you stop fighting your reality and start organizing your energy within it. Love doesn't need perfect conditions. It needs stability. Language doesn't need constant study. It needs regular contact without fear. 2 jobs can coexist with one hope when hope is grounded in systems, not wishes. This chapter wasn't about achieving balance. It was about recognizing it had already begun, quietly, imperfectly, but firmly. The question was no longer, can I survive this? It became, how do I keep this sustainable? And for the first time since arriving in America, that question didn't feel heavy. It felt honest. And solvable. Love survived, so did I. The ending didn't feel like an ending at first. It felt ordinary. A morning without panic. A conversation without tension. A day where nothing dramatic happened, and somehow, that was the victory. After everything, calm felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. But calm, I learned, is what survival looks like after it stops screaming. 2 jobs were still part of my life in the United States. They hadn't vanished. They no longer defined me either. Work became something I did, not something I carried home in my chest. That separation changed everything. Love didn't return with fireworks. It returned with reliability, with trust rebuilt slowly, like muscle memory. We stopped asking whether love could survive and started noticing that it already had. Quietly, patiently, without asking for credit. English followed the same path. It didn't suddenly become perfect or impressive. It became usable, comfortable, human. I spoke without rehearsing every sentence in my head. I listened without panic. I made mistakes and didn't punish myself for them. That freedom accelerated progress more than any intense study phase ever had. This is something language science confirms. Long-term fluency comes from low stress, high-frequency exposure. Not heroic effort. Not endless motivation. Just consistency paired with emotional safety. That's what life finally provided. At home, conversations flowed naturally. Sometimes in English. Sometimes mixed. Sometimes with pauses and laughter filling the gaps. Meaning mattered more than accuracy. Connection mattered more than speed. Love, once strained by exhaustion, now felt resilient. I realized something important about the original question. Can love survive? Love was never the fragile part. The system around it was. 2 jobs, immigration stress, cultural adjustment, language pressure, those were the real threats. Once those pressures were managed instead of ignored, love didn't just survive. It stabilized. The same was true for learning English. People often frame language learning as a personal weakness. Not enough discipline, not enough talent, not enough time. But language learning is deeply environmental. It depends on safety, routine, and emotional relevance. When life stopped feeling like an emergency, learning resumed naturally. Hope changed shape too. It used to be loud, desperate, focused on escape. One day things will be better. Now it was quieter, grounded, focused on maintenance. How do I keep this good? That version of hope lasts longer. I started measuring success differently. Not by promotions or fluency levels, but by nervous system signals. Better sleep. Slower mornings. Laughter without effort. These signs told me more about progress than any checklist ever could. America finally felt less like a test and more like a place to live. Climate, culture, policies, expectations, I no longer fought them. I understood them. Adaptation replaced resistance. And adaptation is where growth actually happens. Looking back, the journey wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about recovering parts of myself that had gone quiet under pressure. Curiosity, humor, patience. Those traits returned when survival loosened its grip. If you're watching this while juggling work, language learning, and a relationship that feels tired but not broken, remember this. Exhaustion can hide success. Silence can hide love. Slow progress can still be real progress. You don't need to quit everything to move forward. You need to align your effort with your energy. You need systems that support you instead of squeezing you. 2 jobs taught me discipline. 1 hope taught me direction. Love taught me endurance. English taught me humility. Together, they taught me balance. This story isn't special because it's dramatic. It's special because it's common and survivable. Many people walk this path quietly, believing they're failing when they're actually adapting. Love survived because we allowed it to rest. English improved because we allowed it to live inside life. Hope stayed because we stopped demanding it perform miracles. That's the ending. Not perfect. Not cinematic. Real. If this story helped you feel less alone, less behind, or less broken, hold on to that. Progress doesn't need applause. It needs patience. And if you want more stories like this, real-life English, slow listening, honest journeys through language, work, love, and life in the United States, stay with this channel. This story didn't end because the struggle disappeared. It ended because I learned how to live inside the struggle without losing myself. 2 jobs are still here. Life in the United States is still demanding. English is still a journey, not a destination. But love survived. Hope stayed. And that changed everything. If you're walking a similar path, working hard, learning English slowly, trying to hold a relationship together while adapting to life in America, remember this. You're not behind. You're building something real. This channel isn't about perfect English. It's about real life, real emotions, and real growth through stories. Stories you can listen to, feel, and learn from naturally. If this video helped you breathe a little easier, if it made you feel seen, or if it gave you quiet strength to keep going, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More slow, meaningful English stories are coming, stories about work, marriage, identity, and life in the U.S., told in a way your ears and heart can grow together. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from or what part of the journey you're on. Like the video so this story can reach someone else who needs it today. This isn't just English practice. This is a shared journey. And the next story is already waiting for you.